NSA is out of control. We're talking about it with Jean Arthur COYLE, a former CIA agent who teaches at Indiana Universities in Bloomington. Thank you for being with us. Denis GADONNET of FireEye, the company that protects companies from cyber attacks. Etienne DROUARD, attorney specializing in intellectual property, information technology, and data protection. Lanah KAMMOURIEH, who's worked on personal data law, taken her from Yale to now the University of Paris. And from Geneva, Michel NESTERENKO of the French Research Center on Intelligence. Welcome back to all of you. Before we resume the conversation, let's say hello to James Creedon. It's time for our Media Watch segment. James, we've been talking about it. The Germans are calling it Handygate.
Handygate, handy being the German way of saying mobile phone, which I always find quite hilarious. But anyway, hashtag Handygate is one of the big trending topics on social media. That's the front page of this Sunday's Bild, German tabloid. So very much a topic of conversation in Germany. Some of the comments I've seen on social media, people sympathising with Angela Merkel, saying she's, you know, just like one of us. The NSA has targeted her too. So across the spectrum, a lot of debate. These contradictory articles as well being shared under the hashtag NSA on social media. This coming from Der Spiegel, saying that, of course, we've heard this already in the last few days, that allegedly Obama was aware of all this going back to 2010, which of course makes it very embarrassing in conversations with Angela Merkel. But then we see the Wall Street Journal reporting that that is allegedly not true and that the NSA allegedly never told Obama about its world leader spying program. So there's a certain amount of confusion on social media as well with these articles which actually contradict each other.
And I noticed one of the difficulties is that they're always quoting unnamed sources in this case, right, especially when we're dealing with intelligence.
That's right, and it's classified information, so you know it's very difficult to actually to verify anything. And of course, the big news of the day is Spain, and I thought it was quite interesting to see Glenn Greenwald tweeting in advance, I suppose the suspense level, and then we saw the front page.
He's the blogger who's been working with Edward Snowden.
That's right, and if you go back to August of this year when his partner was arrested in Britain using terrorism legislation, if you remember at the time, François, he said he's going to be much more aggressive about printing stories now following the detention of his partner, and it has been a solid, consistent drip of information since then, which is keeping the story on the front pages of the papers. If all of this had come out at once, it would have been dealt with at the same time, and the press would have moved on. But this is, maintaining the story on the headlines, I suppose. One thing, just on a humorous note, the hashtag NSA pickup lines. Some people being a bit funny with this sort of thing on social media. In other words, NSA ever present, even when you think you're on your own. We just met, but I feel I already know everything about you. There's also quite a lot of cartoons doing the rounds on social media, François. Here is President Obama in the form of a satellite listening to Angela Merkel. And we'll finish with this one. Danziger, who is a US cartoonist, often in the Los Angeles Times. Here, Merkel is telling him off, reading him the Riot Act, and he's saying, look, but we did it to the French too. And she says, OK, go on, tell me anything good, which I suppose points to what a lot of people are saying about the criticism of the US, that this espionage thing is not just the Americans, it's a global phenomenon, and everybody with the means does it.
All right. Thanks for that, James Creedon. James Creedon with our Media Watch segment there. Now, we were talking in part one of our discussion about how the White House has been playing coy. They've been saying the last few days there is going to be a review of the Patriot Act, which was the legislation that was put forth by the executive order. I guess it's not a law, the Patriot Act. Is it a law?
It is law.
It's a law.
And it's still
not a decree.
It's basically one good example of how American privacy laws have been slowly loosened since the post-9/11 days to make way for easier surveillance, and particularly much easier surveillance of foreign targets. As soon as foreign intelligence is involved, as soon as the phone conversation or the emailing is taking place abroad, there are very few restrictions on wiretapping.
All right, and the White House, the White House is Monday saying there's going to be a review. Details of it quite vague. Back in June, when he visited Berlin on the heels of Edward Snowden's initial revelations, Barack Obama assured his hosts that it was all under control.
What I explained to Chancellor Merkel is that I came into office committed to protecting the American people, but also committed to our values and our ideals. And one of our highest ideals is civil liberties. and privacy. And I was a critic of the previous administration for those occasions in which I felt they had violated our values, and I came in with a healthy skepticism about how our various programs were structured.
Healthy skepticism on Facebook, Adabong saying the worst of it all, Merkel was spied on for a decade and her own security agency had no clue. Barack Obama, there you heard in that reaction, grappling, but as we've been saying, Etienne Drouard, the focus has not been, it's not been that big a story. Our correspondent in Washington earlier telling us that it's just not that big a story. The fact is that there's the feeling over there that, well, this is happening, they're spying on foreigners, they're not spying on US citizens, so we don't really care. Yes,
just after the Watergate issue, there was a law, a FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, allowing most surveillance. Most of it comes from this law, but because it was not US citizens, it was okay. After 9/11 and the Patriot Act, there was also not only this question of being a foreigner, but also this terrorism issue, which allowed surveillance on the US territory against US citizens. The thing that we see now from Europe is that we don't have the same means. And we are far behind that.
All right, don't have the same means. And also the question that you brought up in part one of our discussion, which is it really about fighting terrorism? The Republican House Intelligence Committee Chair, Mike Rogers, said over the weekend, if the French citizens knew exactly what this was all about, they'd be applauding and popping champagne corks. It's a good thing. It keeps the French safe. It keeps the US safe. It keeps our European allies safe. But French Sunday newspaper, Le Journal du Dimanche, doesn't see it that way. In an article entitled How the NSA Spies on the Whole Planet, current and former French spies seem dubious about the keeping the world safe reasoning. It's a bogus pretext. The monitoring, that's a French anti-terrorism specialist speaking, the monitoring of the internet has not prevented any attacks, not even that of Boston, even though the two perpetrators were surfing all day on the web. Jean Arthur Coyle, when the head of the NSA, General Alexander, says that he's managed to stop 50 terrorist attacks, and you see the French shrugging off and saying, where's the, we don't see that. What's your reaction?
Why is it when the head of NSA says something, journalists don't believe a word he says, but any piece of paper handed out by a friend of Edward Snowden is taken as the gospel truth? A small editorial comment about journalism. But yes, the U.S. government over the past 12 years has shared on a number of occasions threats, information about threats, given warnings to various European countries. This whole espionage game, it's sort of like sausage. People like eating the product. Nobody wants to go in and see how sausage is made. The French citizens might not object in the least if the U.S. government gives to the French government information about a couple of terrorists in a French suburb, but they don't want to have any hand in how that's gathered. If you come to some nice, lovely new treaty where NSA won't touch information about Europe, the CIA won't spy on anyone in Europe, fine.
But Jean Arthur Coyle, the point that a lot of the panelists have been making, is that we're dealing with huge numbers now, and it is a new ball game, is it not? When you have everybody has a cell phone that can be tracked, everybody has a computer that can be tracked. Spying is nothing new, as we said at the outset. But the technology is. Shouldn't there be some kind of a sit-down where they establish some kind of international norms and guidelines?
Back in 1929, the Secretary of State at that time, Stimson, when he found out the U.S. was doing code breaking against foreign countries, their messages coming to their embassies, he issued his famous statement, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail," and he shut it down. You also had a treaty, Kellogg-Briand, 1929, where everybody, including the Europeans and the France and the Soviet Union, agreed never to use war against each other. That's a lovely idea, but it didn't work. Any agreement that countries are going to make that they're not going to somehow spy on each other would be just about as practical as the Kellogg-Briand Act. I'm sorry I'm so cynical, but I've dealt with human nature for 30 years. And as far as the size and efficiency, French espionage should not be, looked at as the second tier or anything. Supposedly, it is only number 2 or 3 in the world to the Chinese industrial espionage going on. If the French are
let me get Michel Nesterenko in on that. Michel Nesterenko, do you agree that perhaps it's crocodile tears on the part of the Europeans, most notably the French, who've increased the budget for cyber snooping by a huge amount over the past couple of years as the defense budget in this country has gone down?
Well, the French don't have the financial capacity that the American government has put at the disposal of the NSA, not only the secret budget, but other means of financing secret operations, as we've known in the past and as we've seen a declaration in the Congress. Now, it's very easy to sweep everything under the rug, saying the journalists don't know what they're saying and so on. It's just Snowden. If you read the Washington Post, if you read the New York Times, if you read Reuters every day, you can see a lot of documented instances where the American intelligence community and the NSA foremost have lied. They have lied to the FISA court, they have lied to Congress, and of course it's very logical that they didn't tell the president what he didn't need to know so he wouldn't have to lie himself. So we're here in a real fog where all the information coming from the NSA is suspect. Now, who is targeted? Not only the Europeans, but also the American citizen. And today there are databases which are built by the TSA, in particular used by the TSA, which include a whole bunch of information.
Sorry, what is the TSA?
The Transport Security Agency, which allows you to go into an airplane. Now they're crossing this information from the NSA on one side, from the police data banks, from the hospital data banks, from your working, where you're spending your money, and so on. And statistically, they're making populations which are risky population, potential terrorist population. Now, we all know that this is going to target some racially oriented populations.
It's going to be racial profiling, you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of racial profiling that's going to be happening, and they wanted to keep it secret, but ultimately, blacks are going to be targeted specifically because statistically they are more criminally found in the databases.
All right, so we have a transatlantic argument going here about this. Another Republican congressman who over the weekend said he believes Europeans should be thanking the NSA is presidential hopeful Peter King, who had a few choice words for the French.
But I think the president should stop apologizing, stop being defensive. The reality is the NSA has saved thousands of lives, not just in the United States, but also in France and Germany and throughout Europe. And, the French are someone's to talk. I mean, the fact is they've carried out spying operations against the United States, both the government and industry. As far as Germany, that's where the Hamburg plot began, which led to 9/11. They've had dealings with Iran and Iraq, North Korea, the French and the Germans and other European countries. And we're not doing this for the fun of it. This is to gather valuable intelligence, which helps not just us, but also helps the Europeans.
But it's He points Congressman King points in that statement there to the French in the past doing spying of their own. There was the famous case of Air France, American executives being told not to fly that airline because their conversations might be bugged. Is it tit for tat, Denis?
In fact, if you look at the France. Barack Obama said in January or February that clearly there is 4 countries that clearly attacked his country. The first one was China, and namely mentioned, as well as Russia, Israel and France was the fourth country that attacked the. So we have clearly capacities. I heard that compared to the investment in terms of active and protection against cyber threats, of course there is a huge difference in terms of investment between the US and in France. But if you look at the last programmation militaire from the government, they invest or they ask to the critical infrastructure OIV in France to invest more than 4 million, if I well remember, euros in terms of protections and as well as active protections. In top of that, there is a lot of things that's coming in France regarding the youth university, or we are set up a lot of cyber security way or courts about to train a lot of French people around this issue. So it will take some time in France, but clearly we will be on track as well, very quickly.
So you're saying there are a little bit of crocodile tears on the part of the French.
Exact.
Lanah KAMMOURIEH?
I would say probably a little, especially at the highest levels of government. But the interesting thing about these sound bites is you've got American officials who are more in the know, let's say, than the French president or that a French official would be, saying, trust us, we've saved you from attacks. I don't think it is the French establishment's job or any other country's job to take that for granted and to take their word for it. I think what's important is to have guarantees in place so that citizens know what their rights are. No one is suggesting to implement an international treaty banning all spying. But what I would suggest would be to strengthen the legal protections for the rights of ordinary citizens with things like needing an arrest warrant and needing probable cause before you can look at somebody's email. I don't think that's too much to ask. These are the sorts of protections that existed from a long time in the United States and that are now being undone.
So between between banning spying and what the NSA is doing now, you're saying there's a wide spectrum.
There is a wide spectrum, and there are things that the law can do to guarantee people's
There's a wide
rights.
spectrum, but when the French and the Germans say that they want to strike a deal with the Americans to have some set of rules, is that doable?
I'm not sure that's doable. I wonder how much of this is to have something deliverable to the public for local consumption. I do think it means that this cannot go on. I think it means this has been a PR disaster for the United States and for its diplomacy. And I think it's normal for these governments, at least publicly, let's say, to stand up for their rights and their citizens' rights. I'm not sure if they can't implement a total blanket ban on spying, a no spying deal. But there are degrees. They can make sure that the European law on citizen privacy is respected by American companies and by the American government.
All right, you're talking about the public relations aspect of it, and that was very clear last Friday at that EU summit, the German Chancellor recalling the moral imperative at stake when you spy on an ally.
Others do that, those who do not share our values. But for the future, we have to change something here. And I think the American president sees the necessity of that as well.
And at that same summit, the French president echoed Angela Merkel's intention to set up those rules for eavesdropping. It's uncharted territory, as Lanah KAMMOURIEH was just saying, as illustrated by the question put to François Hollande at the summit.
Are you absolutely sure today that your mobile phone, for example, is not bugged?
We are very careful with all essential communication, which are therefore secured.
Denis GADONNET, what can you tell us about the French president's phone?
He's right. In fact, we have a great company in France that's doing a very solid and hardened encrypted mobile phones.
But apparently both him and his predecessor don't like to use the encrypted phones because there's like a little delay when you call.
It's not an Android. It's not I would not say any other brand, but it's not easy to use. But it's clearly professional, and so we have the French company that's doing that for French government. So they have to use it.
But if François Hollande has an encrypted phone and he calls me, who doesn't have one, can somebody then cyber attack and go in there and take out his address?
No, it's very difficult in this case. In fact, very difficult. The most open, in fact, technology in terms of telephony, it's Android. So we see a lot of example in the world, not only in France, but where the Android applications are infected by a piece of code that's clearly very easy with an Android phone, maybe used by the government, I don't know, to spy anybody.
All right, back in 2011, you were mentioning just then, just before, about how the French also have been accused of doing cyber attacks. Back in 2011, French magazine Paris Match reported on a cyber attack against the French finance ministry. This was during the period before Christine Lagarde went to run the IMF. She was at the helm there. At the time, the paper quoted unnamed sources who said it was definitely sophisticated stuff, a state-sponsored cyber attack. They wondered aloud if it wasn't the Chinese. Now the French press reports it was the NSA, and that the French quietly told Washington to cut it out. Michel NESTERENKO, do the French owe an apology to the Chinese over this?
Well, probably, but I think the French should be very upset not to have seen that it's possible for the NSA to go through a China server to attack France. And we know from the statistics from a few years back that most of the criminal activity in the cyber field came through America. That's where the highest numbers were found, highest number of origination of attacks. So I think the French and the Europeans should be very upset about against the Americans. And I think it's very important to defend the European democracy against the American big brother, who we were told this evening feels that because we want to talk to other countries, we can be considered as terrorists, and we are not, we're not adults in this sense. So they have to take care of us.
Arthur COYLE, that's an important point. Seen from Europe, there's the sense, again, and it's been brought up by several of the participants in this panel, that Americans sort of decide, well, we know what's best for you. We're allowed to spy on you because we know what's best. What do you answer to that?
Well, Mr. NESTERENKO has some interesting facts about the cyber world. I'm not sure they would be agreed to by many of other people, but if you're talking about interfering in European affairs, I know this sounds rather trite, but perhaps France shouldn't, America shouldn't have interfered in Europe back in 1941.
Isn't that a bit easy, though, to say that? We're talking about two different things here.
No, we're talking about people complaining and moaning that America is interfering. We're listening to phone conversations. But as I said, when the U.S. government passes along information about terrorist threats about to be happening somewhere in Europe, no one minds about it then. I guess my snide comment about World War II simply reflects the annoyance by Americans who for decades carried the water on having NATO be a credible deterrence to the Soviet Union. Now nobody wants us to be working on terrorism. So why doesn't America just stay home? And in the future, if there's a war, we'll stay home then too.
All right, Etienne DROUARD.
Yes, I think it's not, you cannot compare periods, especially because we talk about the digital world. Today, you can remotely monitor activities concerning 3 billion people. It did not happen before. But the only nation which is able to do so with the assistance, necessary assistance of service providers is in the US.
Service providers, that's an important point. That is to say, private telephone and internet operators.
Yes, for the first time, no state can do that without the help of private sector. These people are in the Silicon Valley. They are not exactly in Var or Lyon or near Paris. This is why Europe is behind this train. And I'm sure that we will hear the Patriot Act modified on the question of cooperation between states. So between states, there is a kind of new era for negotiations, how to share information in a more transparent way on the purposes. The purposes are good, it's not the question. when there is someone to say that there are only those purposes, but that there is no exception to this.
All right, and all of this, of course, happening in the context of trade negotiations, free trade negotiations between Europe and the United States due to open, where, of course, cyber commerce figures prominently. I want to thank our guests. I want to thank Etienne DROUARD, Denis GADONNET, Lanah KAMMOURIEH, Michel NESTERENKO for being with us from Geneva, and Jean Arthur COYLE for being with us from Bloomington, Indiana. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.